Chapter 11. Donald Davidson, a dupe of the Communist Party. In the end, the party would announce that 2 and 2 made 5, and you would have to believe it. George Orwell. Donald Davidson is one of the most important figures in contemporary philosophy. He made significant contributions to many fields, primarily to the philosophy of mind, the philosophy of action, and the theory of meaning. But in contrast to the high level of sophistication and careful argumentation characteristic of his philosophical work, his involvement with politics sometimes failed the minimal test of rationality. An unjust war yesterday, a just war today. On a number of occasions, Davidson described an interesting episode from the beginning of his academic career when he was a graduate student of philosophy at Harvard in 1941. It is always basically the same story, with slight variations. For example, it suddenly became apparent in the spring of 1941 that the United States was probably going to get into the war. I thought I saw it coming, and my politics were very left-wing. In fact, I certainly was the kind of person that was at the time called fellow traveler. At that time, if you were in those circles, you were against the United States getting into the war. That is what you were told to think. So in order to stay out of armed services, I got into the Harvard Business School. But meanwhile, something else had happened. And that was, of course, that the Germans had invaded Russia, and we fellow travelers at that point changed our minds about the nature of the war. I am not proud of this history, but it is a history that quite a number of people had at that time, certainly a lot of my friends. And again, in a similar vein, my politics were like all my left-wing friends. I never joined the Communist Party, but I followed the party line. When Germany invaded Russia, we fellow travelers changed our minds about the nature of the war. Now there was a good and a bad side. This is a fascinating psychological transformation. Davidson was consistently and strongly opposed to the war against Nazi Germany for a couple of years, and then, suddenly, on June 22, 1941, click. Only then, that is 3 years after Kristallnacht, 2 years after the brutal invasion of Poland, now there is a good and a bad side, and he becomes so enthusiastic about opposing the Nazis that he soon volunteers for service in the Naval Reserve. It is very hard to make sense of such an abrupt change of opinion, especially because Davidson says that up till the German attack on the Soviet Union, with his political views in the penumbra of the party line, he saw the war as a struggle for markets. How could a bad war, a struggle for markets, all at once become a good war, a noble fight against the evil of fascism? The mind reels. While the American Communist Party lost almost half its members after the Nazi-Soviet Pact of 1939, Davidson did not waver in his loyalty to Moscow. It should be stressed that he had both relevant personal experience and close contacts with people with anti-Stalinist views, which should all have naturally protected him from communist indoctrination and prevented him from becoming such a blind follower of the party line. He had actually visited Germany after Hitler came to power, mind you, 2 years after the introduction of the Nuremberg Laws, so he obviously had a good opportunity to see firsthand the rise of the Nazi regime and notice that it had other goals besides getting access to new markets. And we know that around the time of his opposition to the war, Davidson had already become friends with Quine, who was resolutely anti-totalitarian and certainly anti-Soviet. The two of them and another friend drove across Mexico in the summer of 1940 or 1941. And despite the presence of these two potentially strong antidotes to Bolshevik brainwashing, a very intelligent person could still turn into a robot-like creature remotely controlled from Moscow, believing simply what he was told to think. About such people, Orwell said that the Russo-German Pact brought the Stalinists and near-Stalinists into the pro-Hitler position. Notice that this is not just a case of a single individual who, by some fluke, happened to be seduced by Marxist-Leninist ideology. In all likelihood, many more philosophers would have similar stories to tell. For, as Davidson helpfully comments on his own fellow traveler past, it is a history that quite a number of people had at that time, certainly a lot of my friends. Apparently, these friends were not willing later to come forward and talk so openly about their former Stalinist sympathies. It is precisely for this reason that his own sincerity should be all the more appreciated. And yet, philosophers showed surprisingly little interest in this amazing episode. Although Davidson is one of the most prominent thinkers in 20th century philosophy, and although he repeated several times that he and a lot of his friends were dupes of the Communist Party, I had difficulty finding a single comment on this by any philosopher. When Plato and Aristotle famously said that the beginning of philosophy is wonder, they meant philosophers have the ability to be surprised and amazed at many things that other people see as ordinary and uninteresting. Here, however, it is the other way around. Philosophers were those who reacted with a yawn, while other people were astonished because they thought they were facing something close to a real mystery. For example, this is Saul Bellow's comment on the scope of the political irrationality of the communists and fellow travelers like Davidson. Now, there is a real mystery about communists in the West. To limit myself to those, how were they able to accept Stalin, one of the most monstrous tyrants ever? You would have thought that the Stalin-Hitler division of Poland, the defeat of the French which opened the way to Hitler's invasion of Russia, would have led CP members to reconsider their loyalties. But no. Well, it was a deep and perverse stupidity. It didn't require a great mind to see what Stalinism was. But the militants and activists refused to reckon with the simple facts available to everybody. These are harsh words, but then again, this is probably an appropriate description for the behavior in question, a deep and perverse stupidity. Imagine there's no grades. Another window into how leftist politics clouded Davidson's mind is provided by some of his actions during the student movement of the 60s. When the wave of student protests reached Princeton, Davidson was the chairman of the philosophy department. The philosophy students demanded that all grades be abolished because they decided it was demeaning to be graded. Although several members of the department were resolutely against that proposal, Davidson sided with the students. His explanation is interesting. Somewhat to my own surprise, I argued that since no one knew what succeeded in education, the students would probably learn more by being allowed to take an active role in deciding educational policy than by being forced to submit to the traditional policies. It is quite revealing that Davidson admits he was himself surprised that he argued the way he did. It is almost as if it was the students who now told him what to think. Besides, the argument he used to support the students' request is embarrassingly inadequate. It is based on a gratuitous assumption that if the students were allowed to decide about educational policies, they would thereby probably learn more. There was no persuasive evidence then that this is true, just as there is none now. Nevertheless, Davidson somehow managed to convince the majority of his department colleagues to support the students. As we know, many academics at the time succumbed to the pressure to be progressive and condemn the status quo. Imagine there's no grades. It's easy if you try. The next step was to persuade the entire Princeton faculty, and this was promptly accomplished as well. Tim Scanlon, currently a leading moral philosopher from Harvard, undertook to write the necessary brief, and he did it brilliantly. The faculty was won over, the victorious students graduated, and no discernible damage was done. In the very next sentence, however, Davidson contradicts himself and concedes that some damage was indeed done. Namely, it turned out that without grades, students had problems getting into law, business, and medical schools. This easily predictable consequence was completely unforeseen by the Princeton faculty under the influence of Davidson and Scanlon. Anyway, there was a change of heart, and the demeaning practice of grading was soon brought back at the request of the students. But wasn't there also something demeaning about the university professors so suddenly and thoughtlessly changing their views all in order to please the restless students and satisfy their whims? But this was the spirit of the times. Ah, the 60s. As Alan Bloom said, students discovered that pompous teachers who catechized them about academic freedom could, with a little shove, be made into dancing bears. Princeton philosophers and Czech dissidents unimpressed with Angela Davis. In another curious twist, in 1969, Davidson invested a lot of effort in trying to secure an academic job in a top philosophy department for a young radical political activist, Angela Davis. In one matter, I failed. Princeton was undergoing another revolution. It was expanding to admit women. It was suddenly noticed that there were few women teaching there. I proposed that we hire Angela Davis. She was interviewed, but the department faculty was unimpressed, and she wasn't appointed. There are several puzzling things here. First, why did Davidson think that Davis was the best candidate for the extremely competitive academic position in what was arguably the top philosophy department in the country? After all, she didn't even have a PhD at the time, nor any publications, nor apparently any other distinguishing philosophical accomplishment. Second, Davis was mainly interested in Marxism and continental philosophy, areas in no way connected with any topics of Davidson's own research. Therefore, since he was certainly not in a good position to evaluate her work or philosophical promise, there was something awkward in the fact that he played such an active role and pushed for her to be hired. And third, even after he failed to persuade his own department on this matter, Davidson did not give up. He went on to contact the philosophy department at the University of California, Los Angeles, telling the people there about Davis and urging them to hire her, which they eventually did, although only a bare majority voted to offer her a 2-year contract. Among those opposing her hiring was the logician Richard Montague, as well as most other analytic philosophers. At the end of the 1960s, revolution was in the air. Radicalized students were asking for relevant courses in which Marxism would be combined with a critique of American imperialism, social injustice, alienation, consumerism, etc. For some reason, the Princeton philosophy department was deficient in these offerings. But fortunately for students, the chairman was willing to accommodate their demands, although in a rather unexpected way. Under the new dispensation, students could petition for a course on an untaught subject, and our students asked for a seminar on the early humanistic Marx. I agreed that they should have it, but no one in the department, several of whom could have done it competently, volunteered, so I did it myself. I let the students do most of the preparing and talking, and they imported various famous student firebrands from Columbia and elsewhere. It was an interesting experiment, but it would have been better if Angela Davis had been there to teach it. What Davidson implicitly but unequivocally is saying is that he was not competent to teach a course on Marx, but that he nevertheless volunteered to do it. Would a similar arrangement have been possible with a course that went against the sentiment of the age? For instance, if, rather improbably, there had been a group of students keen on taking a course on Ayn Rand's praise of capitalism, and if there happened to be no one in the philosophy department competent and willing to teach it, would the chairman have volunteered to facilitate this learning experience as well? Would he have encouraged the students to invite Randian hotheads from elsewhere to come and run the show at Princeton? Maybe in the Twilight Zone. Finally, there are also problems with Davidson's claim that it would have been better if Angela Davis had been there to teach that course. First of all, given what is known about her philosophical accomplishments at the time and later, there is nothing to support the claim that Davis would have done a better job teaching that Marxism course than the students who in the end took charge of it. Moreover, there is a good reason to think they might have actually been a better choice. For, in contrast to Angela Davis, it is unlikely that they would have supported the imprisonment of political dissidents for thought crimes in communist countries, as she did. Consider the following passage from a talk given by the Czech-Canadian writer Josef Skvorecky in Toronto in 1981. When Angela Davis was in jail, a Czech socialist politician, Jiří Pelikan, a former communist and now a member of the European Parliament for the Italian Socialist Party, approached her through an old American communist lady and asked her whether she would sign a protest against the imprisonment of communists in Prague. She agreed to do so, but not until she got out of jail because she said it might jeopardize her case. When she was released, she sent word via her secretary that she would fight for the release of political prisoners anywhere in the world, except, of course, in the socialist states. Anyone sitting in a socialist jail must be against socialism, and therefore deserves to be where he is. All birds can fly. An ostrich is a bird. Therefore, an ostrich can fly. So much for the professor of philosophy, Angela Davis. Indeed, Gigi Pelican's open letter to Angela Davis received a great deal of publicity in 1972 when it was published in the London Times, the New York Review of Books, and Die Zeit. Pelican urged Davis to join the fight for the liberation of all political prisoners in the world, including Czechoslovakia and the Soviet Union. Davis flatly rejected the appeal, explaining her reasons through her spokesperson, Charlene Mitchell. Miss Davis said, did not think that people should leave socialist countries to return to the capitalist system. This was a retrograde step, and even if such people said that they were communists, they were still acting in opposition to the socialist system, objectively speaking. Miss Mitchell, who said she was acting as a spokesman for Miss Davis, took the line that people in Eastern Europe got into difficulties and ended in jail only if they were undermining the government. Those who left to go into political exile were also attacking their own country. According to Angela Davis, therefore, all those who risked or lost their lives in numerous attempts to escape from East Germany, and by implication, all those who in 1989 started the exodus that led to the fall of the Berlin Wall, were in fact attacking their own country. Davis was soon rewarded for her loyalty. Later that same year, 1972, she was received by Erich Honecker, the communist leader of East Germany, who awarded her the Great Star for International Friendship for her extraordinary service on behalf of the German Democratic Republic. A few years later came the ultimate recognition, the Lenin Peace Prize, which was presented to Davis by Leonid Brezhnev himself. It is precisely in light of these and similar facts, which Davidson must have been familiar with in 1999 when he lamented Davis's non-appointment in the 60s, too, that we can conclude those students in that newly introduced Princeton course in 1969 were in all likelihood exposed to a less crude version of Marxism and less totalitarianism worship when they were instructed by various famous student firebrands than if they had been taught by Angela Davis. Davidson is, of course, far from being the only major philosopher who was fascinated with Davis, but there is an unexpected name on the list of her fans, Alfred Tarski, whom the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy describes as one of the greatest logicians of the 20th century, often regarded as second only to Gödel, and thus as one of the greatest logicians of all time. Since Tarski was a staunch anti-communist who even expressed his opposition to the student movement of the 60s, he was seemingly unlikely to be a Davis admirer. And yet there is evidence for this, as we learn from a highly esteemed biography written by two scholars who both knew Tarski personally. Given Tarski's political views, his doctoral student Benjamin Wells was amazed when, in the mid-70s, Tarski showed him a scrapbook in which he kept extensive newspaper clippings of 3 women associated with revolutionary movements of the period, whom he called my heroes: Angela Davis, Bernardine Dohrn, and Patricia Patty Hearst. An additional puzzling feature is that Davis kept her place on Tarski's list up to the mid-70s, even after her cozying up to communist tyrants in Eastern Europe and her highly publicized refusal to lift a finger to support the persecuted dissidents there, including those in Tarski's homeland of Poland. Another person on the list of Tarski's heroes deserves our attention too: Bernardine Dohrn, a member of the radical leftist organization known as the Weather Underground, or the Weathermen, which conducted a series of politically inspired bombings in the United States in the 70s. Since Tarski kept extensive newspaper clippings of Dohrn and others, he probably could not have missed the memorable part of a long article about the Weathermen that occupied half a page of the New York Times' Sunday Week in Review section on March 15, 1970. Nonetheless, it is difficult to escape the feeling that these youngsters are demented. How else explain the admiration for Sirhan Sirhan, the murderer of Senator Robert F. Kennedy, or for Charles Manson, group leader of a band of alleged murderers. Among these youngsters, there are open jokes about assassinations and a salivating over violence. Witness Bernardine Dorn. Dig it. First they killed those pigs, actress Sharon Tate and her friends, then they ate dinner in the same room with them, then they even shoved a fork into a victim's stomach. Wild. Members of Manson's cult murdered Sharon Tate and 4 other people one night in August 1969, although they hadn't had any previous contact with them. Being in the 9th month of pregnancy, Tate unsuccessfully pleaded for the life of her unborn baby. After she was stabbed 15 times, the killers used her blood to write "pig" on the house's front door. The New York Times got it right. Anyone who, like Dorn, revels in this kind of bestial and gratuitous violence must be demented. It is amazing, however, that apparently it was possible for a person so sick in the mind to be called a hero by one of the greatest logicians of all time.